Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Tuesday, October 29th, 2024. This is The Excerpt. Today, it's 1 week until Election Day. Plus, who would potentially be Donald Trump's allies if there were to be a post-election fight? And crisis hotlines are preparing for a surge in calls on election night. President Joe Biden voted early in the 2024 general election yesterday, casting his last ballot as president, this time for Vice President Kamala Harris.
Joseph Biden now voting.
Biden waited in line to make his choice official at the Department of Elections office near his home in Wilmington, Delaware. The president chatted up the people standing in line as he waited his turn. Biden also said he was dismayed at former President Donald Trump's Sunday rally at Madison Square Garden in New York. The event was marked by racist comments and vitriol by multiple speakers. Meanwhile, Harris yesterday also spoke about Trump's rally, accusing the Republican nominee of, quote, fanning the fuel of trying to divide our country, unquote. For his part, Trump at an Atlanta rally yesterday said it was Democrats who are using disgusting rhetoric to define his campaign. Today marks 1 week until Election Day. You can stay up on all the latest with usatoday.com and The Excerpt. Former President Donald Trump has refused to say whether he'll accept the outcome of next week's election. So could a post-election fight happen? And who would potentially be some of the allies in Trump's corner? I caught up with USA Today domestic security correspondent Josh Meyer to discuss. Hiya, Josh.
How you doing, Taylor?
Good. Thanks for hopping on today, Josh. So let's just start with this before we talk through some of these allies. What does Donald Trump himself really hint at, Josh, in terms of possible plans should he lose next week? Have we heard anything on this point?
Well, yeah, he's talked a lot about it. He hints in very dark terms about how we're not going to have a country anymore. You know, everything that people love about the United States will be gone if Kamala Harris wins, and that they need to sort of rise up and fight back or they're not going to have a country anymore. I mean, this is the same rhetoric that he was using on January 6th before thousands of his supporters went to the Capitol and basically broke in and tried to stop the certification of the election. So he's been speaking in more and more kind of emphatic terms about this as the election gets closer.
So, you wrote about some of these Trump allies for a possible post-election fight. Let's start with Boris Epshteyn. Who is he, Josh?
So Boris is a longtime Trump political advisor, legal strategist, fixer, and campaign operative. He's been described as Trump's wartime consigliere. You know, he's one of the 18 people indicted in Arizona for trying to overturn Trump's loss there in 2020. He's pleaded not guilty, but he's been very active in helping Trump shape this campaign in terms of the campaign itself and perhaps what they're going to do if they lose the election.
Josh, Elon Musk has clearly thrust himself into this race in a number of ways, be it spending or his influence on X. What role could the world's richest person play here?
You know, I've written a lot about this, Taylor, and he could play a very significant role. He already is playing a very significant role. He is now giving away $1 million a day for this voter registration drive for people in swing states. He claims that that's registered tens of thousands of voters. He is using Twitter, now called X, and his 300 million followers on X to basically shovel as many pro-Trump narratives and as much disinformation and critical comments as he can about Kamala Harris. And so there are people that are concerned that that could be enormously interventionist, for lack of a better word, in the election. That this is unheard of, that some media mogul or somebody like that can have that kind of an impact on an election. And so actually just yesterday, we wrote a story about how the Philadelphia district attorney filed a lawsuit to stop him from giving away $1 million a day, saying it's an illegal meddling in the election.
So, Josh, there's also Roger Stone. He's been involved in promoting election conspiracy theories in the past. And this time around, he says Trump can only lose if the election is stolen. How might he factor in here?
Well, so Roger's been saying that for decades. I mean, his candidates only can lose if the election's stolen from them. I mean, that's kind of a old chestnut of his that he's been doing for decades. He is the person who essentially created the Stop the Steal movement in 2020 and told Trump to declare victory and then claim it was stolen from you. And so Stone is a longtime Trump advisor, political consultant, and self-proclaimed dirty trickster. So he embraces that role in the Trump campaign and in other campaigns. And when I have talked to him about this in the past, he said that he's never done anything wrong, but clearly there are people, and there's video evidence that was played, I think, at the January 6th committee hearings that suggested he was involved in the effort to try and overthrow the results of the 2020 election.
All right. Finally, as for Steve Bannon, he'll be released from prison today, a week before the election, Josh.
Yeah.
How involved is he still in the Trump world?
Well, he hasn't been for months because he's been in prison. But before that, he's been very involved. I mean, it's hard to say exactly how much interaction there is with Trump himself, but clearly he's out there boosting the narratives. They have been close in the past. I mean, if you recall, Trump brought Bannon into the White House and even put him on the National Security Council, when he was a senior advisor. But, I think that there's a lot of linkages and coordination or cooperation between the Trump campaign and Bannon in terms of getting the message out straight. He's got this very influential War Room podcast that people listen to. I expect that within hours of him getting out, he'll be back on the airwaves calling for Trump to be elected and saying that the election will have been stolen from Trump if he loses.
All right. Josh Meyer covers domestic security for USA Today. 1 week to go, Josh. Thanks so much.
Yes. Thanks, Taylor.
Around 10,000 North Korean troops are now on the ground in Russia and are likely bound for Ukraine, according to the Pentagon yesterday. A Pentagon spokesperson said the troops are training in eastern Russia and will probably augment Russian forces near Ukraine over the next several weeks. NATO Secretary General said the troop presence indicates a dangerous expansion in the war in Ukraine and a significant escalation in North Korea's involvement in it. It also violates UN Security Council resolutions. Crisis hotlines are preparing for a surge in calls on Election Day. I spoke with USA Today wellness reporter Alyssa Goldberg to learn more. Alyssa, thank you for hopping on the Excerpt today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So let's just start here. Would you tell us about Caitlin and her experience working these crisis lines? This was someone you spoke with and wrote about in this piece.
Caitlin is a crisis counselor, and during the 2020 election, she was a supervisor at Crisis Text Line. And with that, part of her job was overseeing all the conversations that the counselors were having with people in crisis who texted in. So while the volunteers were managing upwards of 10 conversations at a time, she would have 30 conversations on her dashboard and had to make sure that she was not only providing support to the volunteers that could be texting 1, 3, 5, however many people, and then also being able to intervene when she needed to if a crisis reached an imminent risk point.
Wow. And you wrote about this spike in callers that we've really seen on recent election days, election nights. What can you tell us about that spike? What do the numbers say? And really just how severe has this gotten?
Yeah, so in 2016, 988, which is the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, had a historic spike in their callers the day following Election Day and the days following. It was about 65% above their expected caller rates. And the Crisis Text Line as well has received this notable increase in texters both during the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections. And based on what they're pulling this year about how many texts are about election-related anxiety, they're expecting to see a very similar surge, which they're already a bit experiencing with election anxiety as we inch closer to Election Day.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned this election anxiety. Really, how bad has this gotten? Do we have any numbers or data to kind of look at this as we're, as you say, a week away from Election Day?
Yeah, so an APA study was just released earlier this month showing that 69% of US adults are reporting that the 2024 presidential election is a significant source of stress in their lives. And this is a big increase from 2016, where this study only pulled 52% of US adults showing that the presidential election was this great of a source of stress. And this is reflected in other worries too about family strains, relationship strains, misinformation, and distrust in the government as well. And this has been reflected in different studies from the APA and such.
All right. So how are crisis counselors preparing for election night next week? And really, what resources do they have as part of these preparations?
The thing about crisis lines is that they have to be prepared for an array of different crises. For example, Crisis Text Line, their motto is "a crisis to you is a crisis to us." So they're already prepared for people who text in about strains in their relationships or their families experiencing suicidality. But with that, a lot of the worries that people experience around the election are fear for the future, concerns about media bias, concerns about how the election outcome itself would impact their family. So some of the things that supervisors and crisis text line staff are doing with their counselors is providing different tip sheets and training so that they feel fully equipped to handle these conversations. So some of this can look like role playing a conversation with their supervisor to practice how they would address a texter who was in this form of crisis, as well as being able to have resource and tip sheets to refer to so that if additional support or another resource is needed, the counselor already has that at the tip of their fingers to provide it to the person in crisis.
Yes, you mentioned some of the things that do really stress people out about elections. Are there any unique challenges for this year's election in particular?
Yeah, I think with all elections, there's a normal amount of stress about the outcome of just thinking about the future and, of course, having your own beliefs. I think something that the different counselors and staff I spoke to was really stressing that the people who are experiencing election anxiety are coming from all around the political spectrum. They have such different beliefs, and it's really about supporting each individual person. But with that said, of course, this is a very polarizing election, and we're in such a politically charged time that the election can feel maybe more intense than past years.
You know, a troubling kind of another aspect to this story is the effect that these calls and texts have on those working the crisis lines. Can you talk through that a little bit?
Working with people in crisis, your number one goal is to support those people. But of course, there are things that affect you emotionally. And what was interesting was just hearing about the different crisis counselors and supervisors sharing how we're all in the same political climate. So just because one person is the caller or the texter and the other person is a counselor doesn't mean that they can't be experiencing similar feelings and stressors around the election. So I think there's a bit in the same way that people can get election anxiety, being exposed to it as a counselor can be similarly stressful. But what was great about through talking to these lines was that supervisors and staff are really on hand to be able to step in and support their counselors, as well as counselors having chats on the side to just support each other through particularly difficult conversations. So just the idea of being swamped by election anxiety as, you know, a counselor is a real thing, but there is support from the centers themselves that's being provided to help get through a very busy time.
All right. Alyssa Goldberg covers wellness for USA Today. I appreciate the story here. Thanks, Alyssa.
Thank you so much.
If you are struggling with election anxiety, help is available. Call or text 988 or contact Crisis Text Line by texting elections or elecciones to 741-741. It's National Cat Day, and the U.S. is one of the top 3 countries with the most cat owners, boasting 46.5 million feline-friendly households. If you're one of them, share your cat or other pet photos, along with any questions or comments you might have about the show at podcast